Hey, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co., and this is not my usual studio space. This is a conversation about Elden Ring, and more specifically, first impressions about Elden Ring. I do apologize for the echo that is in this location. I'm working with what I got here. I'm currently traveling to Poland to the GameFound offices. I went to England to play Elden Ring with Steamforged Games, currently in Poland at GameFound, and we're going to have a conversation about Elden Ring. I want to get this up, at a reasonable time, so not my usual filming space. In any case, let's go ahead and dive into it. Hopefully I'll be able to layer over some degrees of B-roll on something. I can't guarantee it. I am traveling, like I said before, but we'll do what we can. But I wanted to talk about my experience with Elden Ring. As usual, I will have timestamps to all the various locations so you can hop about and find the various areas that you're interested in, whether it's how the game plays, first impressions, disclaimers, all of those things. But let's talk about what Elden Ring is, what the experience is, because Elden Ring is Steamforged's latest title. Steamforged Games has put out a whole bunch of games but becoming famous, I want to say, with the Dark Souls series of games that they put out on Kickstarter, rapidly becoming one of the most successful Kickstarters out there, at least board game Kickstarters. And they've moved to a whole bunch of other properties, a whole bunch of other games, from Monster Hunter World, from the Resident Evil line of games, to Bardsum, to a variety of different games that they have continuously put out again and again, and now they currently have Elden Ring. Elden Ring continues their Dark Souls series. They actually have a few more Dark Souls core boxes, but Elden Ring is an entirely different beast. The gameplay is entirely different, the structure is entirely different, everything about it is entirely different. From having played Dark Souls, I can tell you that Elden Ring is, an entirely different beast. The structure of Elden Ring is broken up into two phases. You're going to have the exploration phase and then the combat phase, or the boss phase, although it's a little bit intermingled because of the fact that you could have combat intermingled with exploration. You're going to be walking around the board, taking 3 actions every turn. Those 3 actions are true whether you are engaged in combat or whether you are exploring. You're going to take 3 actions. Actions consist of moving or interacting around this as you try to move around the board in different ways, navigate to fulfill the various quest requirements you have, because the game is going to be divided into, I don't recall the count, it might have been 15 quests, if I recall correctly, in the core set. I'm not certain. And obviously, Kickstarter, stretch goals or expansions and all those things are a different conversation. But each quest will have specific requirements or goals you're trying to go for. Collect these different things. Don't let the timer run out. Interact with these locations. Do these things. And you're going to be wandering around this board as you do so. Again, 3 actions per turn. You do have to be mindful of the timer ticking down. There is a degree of pressure around what you do. You can't just sit and watch the roses grow. You have to interact. You have to explore. You have to find the next thing. And so you're building and uncovering this map as you grow, laying down these hexagonal tiles as you move around the board, laying down the interaction points on them, and then engaging with the world around you in different ways. Engaging with merchants and interacting with their rumors and the goods that they have. Interacting with various tokens that will give you other benefits, either whether now or later in the boss encounter phase. Whether you try to gather different materials because the quest requires you to gather different materials, you're spending your actions interacting while trying to ensure the timer doesn't run out. Along the way, one of the things that you're going to be interacting with are the enemies you have to fight. And so you do have to fight against these enemies, and that means you're going to have these different encounter books that you're going to be flipping to the right enemy, the right page, figuring out who it is you're engaged with combat against as you try to figure out how to outpace them, how to outmaneuver them because of the battle system they have in play. This is where Elden Ring has 2 sides to it. They have the exploration phase, they have the battle phase, and the battle phase is also broken up into battling minor enemies versus the boss battles you're going to encounter. Boss battles have the same general rules as regular battles, just on a larger scale and with more threatening and more dangerous enemies. And so you have these enemies you're facing off against, and again, you still have 3 actions per turn. The way the game system is going to work is you're going to have an initiative row, so when you engage in combat, you're going to shuffle up the cards of the enemies involved in combat, you're going to deal them out, and there are opportunities for your allies to jump in and help you in combat. We'll talk about that later. But you're going to have this initiative row, and then the enemy is going to take their action, and they're going to follow their own initiative card that defines how they interact. This is where you can learn the sequence of how enemies move. You know that they're going to dodge to the left, strike forward, move back, and retreat. You can follow what enemies are going to do as they do it. They have an AI system that you can predict around it, which is going to be very reminiscent to those of you who have played Dark Souls games. The idea of figuring out their pattern and trying to figure out how to get your own blows in while you evade the enemies. That is very much the puzzle of Elden Ring, and they managed to capture that in the board game very well because you can see what the enemies are doing. You can figure out how they're going to attack, and it's not always easy to evade. In fact, more often than not, it's not easy to evade. It's about choosing your moments carefully. It's about choosing when you think you can take that blow so you can get your lunge back in versus when you think you can dodge or dance around it in order to get your advantage going. because when it's your turn in the battle flow sequence, you will take 3 actions. You will take 3 actions as well. So again, you're taking 3 actions no matter what happens. And this way you have an interesting aspect to the game in which you could have 2 players or 3 or 4 players playing the game, and they're engaged in different phases of the game. I'm currently exploring the map as you take your battle flow sequence, and so that aspect of having 2 things going on at the same time is very present, and it was something I was worried about, but it does work well. It keeps the game flowing nicely as you go through it. And in battle, your actions are managing your hand of cards, which are the actions you can take, and then managing your deck of symbols, which are the things that power the actions you're taking. So it's a 2-deck system as you go through the experience. You're going to choose to spend your 3 actions. Do you want to play an action card? Do you want to draw a card into your hand? Or do you want to move around the board? And this is where they have the battle stance system in the game. You see, the enemies are on their own side of the board, and you're on your own side of the board, but where you are on your side of the board, the lane you're in, the column you're in defines how or where you can avoid or hit the enemies. Versus the row you're in defines your battle stance. What advantage will you have over the enemies? Are you going to be more aggressive, more defensive, more tactical? And different map boards will have different degrees of the way they approach that battle stance, where terrain matters, where there are walls in the way, and of course your own character's abilities. And so you're, again, trying to juggle this map, figuring out which row and column you want to be in, because all of them have different reasons to be there at different points in the game. When you're done with this whole sequence, when you eventually make your way to the boss fights, not all quests end in a boss fight, but many of them do, you're going to deal with a bigger, badder, much worse version of whatever you've dealt with until now. The same battle flow sequence is in play, but the map might be different, the boss rules might be different, and the bosses, instead of having a single defined card as to how they act, instead they have a deck of cards which makes them a little bit more unpredictable. Across the course of a boss fight, you will likely find yourself going through the deck multiple times, so there still is that degree of learning your enemy, figuring out how they move, how they dodge and dance around you. So you still have to learn them, but you're learning them with less predictability around what they're going to do on any given turn, and instead you're learning them with the idea that you have to be mindful as to what you can do that you can get them, well, killed. This is where we'll go ahead and move to my first impressions, and excuse me as I have notes and all that stuff. Usually I have this stuff taped to a camera, the bullet points I cover, but again, I'm working with what I have over here, so let's get this moving. But as far as what I like, don't like, and can see others not liking about Elden Ring, and before I dive into this, we should, let's cover, I'll do my disclaimers and final thoughts. Let's save my disclaimers for final thoughts, so if you want any disclaimers around Steamforge, my relationship with them, any of those things, I'll have all those in final thoughts. But for right now, what I like, don't like, and can see others not liking about Elden Ring is as follows. First of all, as far as what I like, the exploration is simple and engaging. The exploration is not the most complex game I've ever played. It's very reminiscent of Skyrim, the board game, to me, as far as giving you a simple degree of engagement as you wander around the board, as you choose the next action you're taking, as you figure out how to evolve on this quest that you're going through, but the exploration just gives you a reason to keep on moving. It also breaks up nicely the combat. The combat itself is a lot more fun to me. If I'm picking the part of Elden Ring that resonates with me, that gives me a lot more of a sense of enjoyment in the game, it's going to be the combats. The combats in the actual exploration phase as well as the boss fights. But having that exploration breaks up the flow nicely. You're constantly balancing between what you do and how you do it. You're constantly balancing between getting that next token, talking to that merchant, moving to a new location, being mindful of the timer around you, and then occasionally breaking up so you can jump into a combat sequence. That breaking up of the fact that you have a nice simple exploratory system along with the combat keeps the game engaging, and the combat is the part that really resonates with me. The combat doesn't look inspiring. It's worth noting that the combat does not look inspiring, because I know that the first time I saw the combat board, I did not think it was that interesting. Even as Steamforge Games talked about, how cool and impressive this combat board was, I just wasn't that intrigued by it. It looked like a plain grid, a vanilla grid of just black and white, and just didn't really pull me in, but the combat really does give you a puzzle. Throughout our gameplay, and it's worth noting, if you want a link to it, I'll have a link at some point. I don't know when the gameplay is going up, but I will have a gameplay and an interview with Steamforge Games as well, and as we go through that, it's worth covering the fact that if you watch that gameplay, you'll see multiple times in which I have a degree of take-backsies, where I want to adjust my move, where I figured out a better strategy, and I love that in games. I love that aspect in games where you have reasons to want to rethink how you're doing something, where the game is not a purely, well, this is the obvious sequence forward. Rather, the game is giving you a choice. The game is giving you a puzzle, trying to navigate how you're going to outmaneuver the enemies at any point. Both the individual the fact that you walk into the boss fight with the consequences of what's happened during the exploration phase means even if a smaller enemy isn't that much of a threat, if they are in any way going to threaten your health, they inherently are a threat. because that means you're walking to the boss fight with fewer health, with less health. And less health means you're more likely to die, and more deaths means you're more likely to actually lose the encounter. And so you have to be mindful of that as you go through it. And so it's constantly a threat. The entire system is constantly a threat. You feel on your toes the entire time. You feel like you plan around what's going to happen. You have a degree of balancing the odds, because as you play an action card, it's powered by your symbol deck, and your symbol deck is something you'll craft and iterate throughout the game, and trying to figure out how to balance around that, and when to rely on being able to get that perfect hit in, when to save that last action because you need to retreat, versus when to hope you draw the right card that will let you both get a lunge in and retreat at the same time. It gives you a degree of pushing your luck. It gives you a degree of strategy, and it gives you a degree of tactical planning about where you want to be at all times because of the stance system. Everything has a reward. It's timing what you want at what point. That's going to be the challenge of playing through Elden Ring. The combat system is immensely enjoyable. Past that, of course, the miniatures. Miniatures in general, the general production quality, although I do have nitpicks, although prototype as well, so we should cover that. But overall, to me, the main appeal of Elden Ring is the fact that it gives me a simple, plain, exploratory system, and simple and plain is the key word. There's no great depth there, but it breaks up the combat that is very enjoyable with a degree of simple exploration, and gives me overall a puzzle that is satisfying. Although, as far as what I don't like, there's really three things, or at least three things right now. First of all, the artwork in general. And this is a beef I've had with Steamforged games for a while, although not necessarily their fault. It's the nature of working with IPs, with intellectual properties. But when it comes to Steamforged games, very often I haven't loved the art that they present in games. They're working with IPs, which often means in-game assets to a degree. And overall, the aesthetic appeal of Elden Ring, I like the miniatures. The miniatures are great, but the rest of the components haven't really done it for me so far. This is where it's worth noting everything I've played is prototype, so all stuff subject to change. But as far as the general assets and tokens and things, some of them I know are changing, but what I have engaged with, it's okay. I'm not overly pulled in by the aesthetics of the game past the miniatures. Additionally, another thing I did not like is the fact that I felt the boss fight was too easy. Now, you may have heard that, and I've only played, it's worth noting, this is very much a first impressions, it's not a review, but I have, a full exploration and quest under my belt with the exploration phase, the boss phase, all that, but that's all I have. And so the singular boss fight I played as, though, I felt it was too easy, while also feeling it was challenging that I had to stay on my toes. Now, what I mean by that, again, if you watch the gameplay, is the fact that you're able to acquire these tokens that are effectively additional lives for you. So you have these additional lives that you're trying to cash in on, or trying not to cash in on as you go through this boss fight. And I would say that the boss constantly felt like a threat. The boss was constantly in your face, ready to chase you down, and you had to balance around trying to not die as much as you could possibly not die. The problem is we walked into the boss fights with enough lives that while I felt threatened the entire time, I don't know if it actually was a threat. I don't know if it would have been... We walked into the boss fight with 4 deaths amongst us, and we only used one of them. And granted, supposedly, I can easily see someone using 2, maybe 3. I just feel to use 4 deaths would have been a degree of just way too easy, and so I'm curious about the scaling of how difficult the game will be. I enjoyed feeling threatened the entire time, and I've said this before in other videos, in other conversations, that I prefer the feeling of being threatened in a game, and I don't actually care if I am threatened, so it's only a halfway critique, but I do want to feel that sense of actual risk. I do want to feel, to a certain degree, that we actually might lose this boss fight, and I can't say I really felt that. I just felt that the boss was big and threatening, but we had enough lives to compensate for that, and so something I'm mindful of is the difficulty scaling around the game, such that I wanted to feel like it's always providing a difficult experience that is hard to overcome. As far as I can see others not liking, do I even have that? I don't really have what I can see others not liking. I have considerations and concerns. Considerations and concerns is more of a category here that, because of the nature of this being very much a first impressions, I have specific thoughts that I'm curious about how things will play or iterate across, well, who knows how many games. I played one quest. I enjoyed myself. We'll talk about that in final thoughts, but I do want to talk about the things that I'm worried about for the future. The first thing is that will combat iterate enough to invest me in it on an ongoing basis? That's just the fact that the combat sequence we saw in our prototype, and again, prototype, we didn't have all the rules, all the things, but we had a very compelling puzzle, a puzzle that I enjoyed, both against the minor enemies as well as against the boss. I very much enjoyed it. But I'm curious about how combat will iterate. This is something I talked about in my interview with Steamforged Games. You can watch that. They talk about how there will be degrees of iteration. There'll be terrain effects, there'll be walls, there'll be different symbols and mechanics and different things going on. And that is something I'm very curious about because I very much enjoyed what I saw, but I think it's something that absolutely deserves to be continuously iterated upon as you go through quest books. They're using quest books, and I hope they make full advantage of those quest books, but I do want to see how it continues to iterate across who knows how many combats. Would failing and repeating a puzzle still be enjoyable? That's another aspect I haven't gotten to experience. We won our first fight. We won our first quest. We only had the one experience. But if you do die, if you do find yourself losing, is it enjoyable or tedious to repeat things? How often and how much? Again, another thing they talked about is the fact that you will find yourself in situations that supposedly are harder, and you will die from them. You'll have to pick yourself up and go pick another quest to go down, and level up your character, and level up your stats, and eventually re-tackle things. I am curious if they can get right that process of failing and repeating things in a way that is enjoyable and doesn't feel like grind. It will ultimately take time to feel that way. I am optimistic based on what I experienced, but it also depends on how often you're failing and repeating and how that puzzle plays out. And then the last thing, which is very much in line with these other two, but as a general kind of arc, which is how long will the puzzle remain enjoyable? This is where I'll pull from two ends of the spectrum, including from Steamforged Games themselves. There's Gloomhaven, a game that I am, 100 hours deep in by now, maybe 75 hours deep into Gloomhaven. I have many, many hours into Gloomhaven, and I'm still enjoying that tactical puzzle. I'm enjoying the process of picking two cards, the top half, the bottom half, despite the fact that so often it's just kill a room of enemies, kill a room of enemies, kill a room of enemies. I am still hours and hours deep into that and enjoying the process of leveling up my character, gathering the next thing, trying the next character, and finding a way to continuously have Gloomhaven be an enjoyable arc that's 75 hours deep into it. I'm enjoying it. And I'll contrast that with Bardsung. Bardsung from Steamforged Games themselves is a game that I got maybe 10 to 15 hours deep in it, probably kind of 15 hours deep or so, and at that point I was kind of done with the loop. The process of leveling up was enjoyable, getting that new spell, that new gear was always fun, but the puzzle of executing on it, of utilizing it, wasn't as prevalent 15 hours deep, at least not for myself. And this is a question I definitely have around Elden Ring. How long will this gameplay loop be satisfying? How long will it be something that engages me and pulls me in? Versus at what point, in which quest, in which expansion will it get to the point where I'm like, that was fun and it's ready to move on? I don't have that answer, and it's something that time will ultimately be the deciding factor on as far as my experience with Elden Ring. Which brings me to final thoughts. Final thoughts, but first a disclaimer around Elden Ring in general, around Steamforged Games in general. The first is understand that my experience with playing Elden Ring was at an event, a specifically hosted Steamforged Games event in which they brought in a bunch of content creators to sit down, play the game, to have everything set up studio-wise, all these things, which is great. It's nice. And if you want to factor in the bias around that, the fact that I got to play Elden Ring while sitting down with Steamforged Games team, with the designer, with Sharon, with Matt, and playing games with them, and if that altered and affected my experience, absolutely take that into account. You should. You should take into account because, let's be honest, it's fun. It's fun being there in Steamforged Games offices, being able to talk to these people and play games with them. It is absolutely fun. Secondly, I've been working with Steamforged Games for a while now, and this is where I'm going to tell you during final thoughts that Elden Ring is, I believe, my favorite Steamforged Games title so far. Not just my favorite Steamforged Games title. I really, really liked my experience with Elden Ring. But I want you to take into account the fact that buzz and hype, it's always so easy to have the next Kickstarter, the next crowdfunding project, and to talk about how exciting it is. It's the best game ever. And I do want to be mindful of that. I think time will bear me out on this one. I do. I think when, you fast forward 2 years down the road, I think Elden Ring will be Steamforged Games' highest rated title. Possibly, they have that. I haven't played God Tier, it's worth noting that, and I haven't played their football one, which is well rated. Their football fantasy, I can't remember what it is, but I haven't played them all, so I can't talk about all their games. But I believe Elden Ring will be very well received once it arrives. But it's worth noting, especially because they've had Dark Souls, and Dark Souls has had critiques around the grind or the process and how enjoyable it was. But I really liked Elden Ring. Ultimately, time will tell whether it bears me out. I do have a good relationship with them. I want to be mindful of the biases of all those things, so take all of this into account. But I just really had a good time with the game. The exploration phase is very reminiscent of Skyrim, a game that I've also talked about enjoying as well. The fact that it's a simple experience that is compelling to go to the next spot, grab the next token, do the next thing. It's a simple gameplay loop that engages me. But that's not the part about Elden Ring that I love. That's the part about Elden Ring that I could be nicely positive about while not really being enthralled with the system. To me, the combat was just rewarding. the combat deck and the idea and the concept of building out your characters. We haven't even talked about the fact that every character has their own unique aspects to them, and you can build and develop your characters, things I haven't been able to see yet because of my limited experience. But Elden Ring absolutely, it was just fun. Again, if you watch the gameplay, you'll see me invested in the decision space. You'll see me invested in trying to figure out how to optimize around the puzzle of trying to dance and dodge around the enemy while lashing back, trying to preserve our lives as much as possible, trying to not die. And it all feels like a tactical puzzle that is immensely engaging. It very much calls from the type of systems I like in games, and Elden Ring gave me that system I like in games. Comparing it to Steamforged Games' other titles, it's completely different than Dark Souls to me. It didn't feel vaguely reminiscent. Dark Souls has a degree, when you have the boss encounters in Dark Souls, there is a degree of dodging, dancing and dodging around the enemies, and having the boss have their own deck of cards. There's a slight overlap. But it is so much more than Dark Souls in terms of even the boss fights, and I think more so than Monster Hunter World in terms of the feeling of dancing and dodging around an enemy, and the sense of progression that might be there as we continue to level up. Overall, I am very optimistic. When I said it might be my favorite Steamforged games, I only meant in the sense that I'm, 3 hours into it? 3 hours into it does not make a favorite game, at least not yet. But it's the best, it's certainly the best first 3 hours I've had in any Steamforged title. There are many Steamforged Games titles I like. There are many Steamforged titles that I have been critical of and moved on from. Elden Ring is one that I am very, very optimistic around. I think that's where we are for this one. As far as other game recommendations, if you're looking for other things to pay attention to, first of all, I mentioned already, but if you like the exploration system in Elden Ring, I highly recommend taking a look at Skyrim, the board game from Modiphius Entertainment. Gives you a very similar arc in terms of the general sense of exploration, a little bit more in terms of the narrative and story, and a little less rewarding in terms of the combat puzzle that it will give you. And if you like the combat puzzle of Elden Ring, then I have to recommend Too Many Bones. Too Many Bones from Chip Theory Games is a delightful experience which also takes place on a very dry-looking map, but ultimately gives you a very rewarding combat puzzle. That's basically what I have for you. Again, I apologize for the echo in the space. I'm working with what I have over here. Hopefully I managed to get some B-roll overlaid on top of this so it's not just me and Game Found wall behind me the entire time. But in any case, until next time, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co. I hope you enjoyed this video. And as always, I hope you have a good one.